Battlefield has had its fair share of ups and downs. The high highs of that first Battlefield 1 reveal trailer to the low lows of that Battlefield 5 reveal trailer.
Hello, old friend.
But among those ups and downs sits a game perhaps perfectly in the middle of good and bad. Something that fans new and old can all agree sure was a Battlefield game, at least in title. And that was Battlefield Hardline. Genre swapping from an over-the-top military action shooter to an over-the-top police action shooter, Hardline is the biggest leap from core Battlefield we've ever seen, and probably the biggest we ever will see. But now that we're a good decade removed from this bizarre title, I wanted to really dive in and see what worked and didn't work about the game, and to really do a full autopsy of this cold corpse and see if we can excavate all the different reasons that this game ultimately failed to resonate with players. Welcome to Game Rant. My name is Austin, and today we'll be revisiting Battlefield Hardline. And let's just start out here by giving a bit of context to the Battlefield franchise around the time that Hardline dropped. Starting out as a classic World War II shooter, now turned into a modern-era juggernaut, Battlefield was known throughout the Xbox 360 era for its large-scale, larger-than-life feeling battles, and insane graphics and lighting engine that honestly still looks pretty incredible to this day. Playing a Battlefield game was like living through your own war story. Everything just felt so cinematic, no matter what you did. And leading into Hardline was Battlefield 3, released in 2011, followed by BF4 just 2 years later in 2013, which I bring up together only because of all Battlefield titles released back to back, these two were by far the most similar. Of course, Battlefield 4 did a bit to iterate on the formula, and once most of the bugs were squashed from the first weeks or months of release, was actually a pretty decent game. It could very much be summed up as more Battlefield 3. Which again, this was a lot of people's favorite era of the series, so by no means is that a bad thing. However, it does go to show the bit of stagnation that was there. And combine that with BF4's rough launch in terms of bugs and server issues, and EA was left a bit on the back foot going into 2015. But thankfully, they had what was primed to be their ace in the hole ready to go. Enter Battlefield Hardline. See, while DICE was busy developing a new Battlefield game every 2 years or so, many other AAA titles were beginning to go yearly. You had Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, and even for a brief time Halo, supplementing its off years with remasters and spin-offs. And seemingly EA wanted to get in on that action too. So they brought over Visceral Games, another studio under EA, who previously worked on the Dead Space series, to develop a spin-off game to slot in between main Battlefield titles. However, this would be a complete shift in tone from the rest of the series, ditching that military setting entirely and instead going with a war on crime approach, as they put it. It was Cops and Robbers, a completely new take on the series, and honestly, something completely new for the genre. It really was a huge gamble, and, well, it wasn't a gamble that EA really won. Personally, I remember seeing this reveal trailer and actually being pretty hyped. I'm the kind of person who really likes when games play with their settings a bit. You know, take the classic formula and throw it into a new setting and see what kind of new sandbox can be generated from it, like Tiny Tina's Wonderlands spinning Borderlands into a fantasy setting, or even going as far back to Far Cry 3's Blood Dragon. Both really ambitious, huge swings in genre and tone that really worked out in the end. I mean, people still talk about how good Blood Dragon was to this day, and that game is, what, 15 years old? All's to say that the leap from military shooter to police shooter didn't seem that crazy, at least to me at the time. In fact, I actually kind of put it in the same camp as the Battlefront reboot, which if you didn't know, is also made by DICE. It's Battlefield in space, in the same way that this is Battlefield with cops. But the problem was that while Battlefront was a completely separate franchise with its own player base and target audience, Hardline had that Battlefield sticker on it. They were marketing it directly to Battlefield fans. but what they ended up getting was just a bit too far removed for many. But what exactly was so different about Hardline? For one, it all felt a bit more scaled down. Now, not to say that it was small scale by any means. It was still massive teams and massive maps with massive cranes that would collapse halfway through the match in signature Battlefield Levolution style. But in addition to the regular Battlefield modes, Hardline really expanded on the game mode offering that really forced players together more compared to the big conquest modes present in past games. For instance, there was Heist, which was literally just cops versus robbers. One team breaks into a vault and collects cash, while the other team has to stop them. And you had Hotwire, which placed your conquest flag on vehicles that would only tick up in points if you stayed over a certain speed. And there was Rescue, a 5v5 one life mode based around defending or extracting hostages, all of which are pretty unique, especially by Battlefield standards, which usually has little more than just their main course of rush and conquest on offer. And that variety extended to classes and equipment too. Because these guys are cops and criminals and not soldiers, that meant an entirely different sandbox of goodies, including stun guns, riot shields, grappling hooks, zip lines, trip mines, cameras, and even a stunt driver gadget that added nitrous to your vehicles. But above all, what really put Hardline on a different level was its aura. Whether or not you like the buddy cop movie, over-the-top action aesthetic, you've got to admit that they really nailed the feeling of it. Everything from the loading screens being news coverage of the events you're about to play through, to unlocks being driven by a cash system just fits into the style so well. And speaking of, as part of diving into Hardline's history here, I also wanted to dive into the game itself in present day. Because believe it or not, I was actually one of Hardline's biggest defenders way back when. I mean, I even have the Platinum Trophy to prove it. Now, there are plenty of titles that are this old or even older that you can still usually find a pretty decent player base on, but unfortunately, Battlefield Hardline just isn't one of them. Well, that's not entirely true. At any given time, there actually is usually one active lobby, but they're mostly just playing the old and faithful modes like Conquest, On the Bank, or Downtown maps. Which, don't get me wrong, those two maps actually are pretty good, and arguably the most iconic part of this entire game. But I was actually really looking forward to going back to some of the stuff I didn't fully remember. You know, I really wanted to try out that Hotwire game mode again, because it was something that was actually really unique and I remember really enjoying back in the day. But unfortunately, there was just nothing. I even made my own lobby and waited for people to join, but it's a complete ghost town. All that said though, in my few hours of trying my best to go on a stroll down memory lane, I actually did have a bit of fun. Played a few games in that populated server I mentioned before trying out a few of the less populated ones just to see what they were up to. I got to jump in a chopper and do that classic Battlefield thing of completely forgetting how helicopter controls work and crashing it into the side of a building immediately, which wasn't my proudest moment. I even found a guy on a motorcycle and we jousted for a bit on the outskirts, ramping off of each other until eventually, well, that wasn't my proudest moment either. So at the very least, you could say that the open sandbox element of Battlefield was still very much alive and kicking, for whatever that's worth. So now let's talk about the fallout of Hardline and what exactly it did for the series. So first of all, sales-wise, this game was a huge speed bump in the franchise's otherwise pretty linear rise up to and after this point, with it only selling a reported 1.5 million copies in the first week compared to Battlefield 4's 2.5 mil. And then there was a pretty steep drop-off after that first week, eventually capping out at around 4 million total copies sold, which is a massive number, don't get me wrong, but for reference, BF3 sold over 5 million in its first week alone, and that was 5 years earlier when the series and gaming as a whole was overall less popular. And within the core community, many didn't take Hardline too well, especially given its proximity to Battlefield 4 just 18 months or so prior, which launched in a really buggy state that many fans fans felt they only just started smoothing out by the time that news of Hardline began hitting their feeds. And couple all of that with the genre shift while still maintaining that Battlefield branding, and you had a game prime for people just to skip. Thankfully though, Hardline didn't turn out to be bad per se, or at the very least not franchise dooming bad. It was just a weird little detour, and ultimately forgettable, especially by the time that Battlefield 1 rolled around just the very next year and smashed all records, going on to be the most played title in franchise history. And that more or less cemented this little experiment as a failure for EA, as they never tried the multiple studio / spin-off idea again since, instead actually putting more space in between releases and having DICE move over to develop the new Battlefront games in the years between. As for Visceral, they were eventually shut down shortly after the last of Hardline's post-launch DLC, while they were partway through another Star Wars project that unfortunately was cancelled alongside with the studio, leaving Battlefield Hardline as the final released game on the studio's long resume dating all the way back to the late 90s. So, long story short, Hardline didn't work. You probably knew that just from the title of this video. But what I find interesting is that the core concept and even execution of that concept wasn't really terrible. Review scores from back then even show that it wasn't a train wreck of a game by any means. And as someone who played it back then, it wasn't like everyone was just hating on this thing 24/7. It was more apathy than anything. Apathy and confusion. To me, this game was always nothing more than a fun little detour with a cheesy story that knew it was cheesy, and an all-out balls-to-the-wall multiplayer experience that took a few huge swings to mixed results. I wouldn't have wanted the entire series to shift to this new cops and robbers format, but a bit of variety and experimentation always keeps things fresh. But unfortunately, they just can't all be winners, leaving Hardline as nothing more than a spin-off game that was set up to fail by the expectations of the franchise around it. It wasn't a Battlefield game, they said. And honestly, they were right. Hardline isn't Battlefield. And you know what? I think that's okay. But that'll about do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and for more like this, be sure to check out GameRant.com.